Hello, everybody. Very welcome to all the early birds who are there to take part in our early Saturday meeting. And let us start with the first plenary session. And let me introduce to you the first speaker for our plenary session. Here is Professor Imanol Ordorika, Professor of Sociology and Education in the National Autonomous University of Mexico. His research projects are well known and focused mostly on the quite interesting and provoking and fruitful attempts to ground political science categories and political science approaches onto the ground of university development and transformation. And this really aroused some provoking question on the nature of academic groups, competition within university, and knowledge production and good governance practice in university, especially taking into account globalization and transformation of universities. And I really do believe that such a sophisticated understanding and approach to the political nature of university also has its roots on personal background of a professor who is was one of the brightest student activists and also founder of political party and political figure, and acts at the present time as political figure and public intellectual. So we all really look forward to hearing some provocative report and thought-provocative presentation. So the floor is yours. I think that we have some 40 or 45 minutes for presentation and then some time for questions and comments. So, very welcome.
Good morning to all of you, especially for being here on Saturday. Thank you, Sergey, for this very nice presentation. And I'd like to thank Isaac and Maria for the invitation to be here. You know you're in a little bit of trouble when your presentation is portrayed as provocative. But I do hope to be able to create some interest and stir up a little bit of a discussion about universities by looking at them from a political sociology perspective. I was asked by Isaac to prepare a PowerPoint presentation. I don't like it very much because I don't usually do it very well with PowerPoint. There it is. It disappeared. Yeah. So he didn't like my comment at all. So, there it is. So, well, this is what my presentation is going to be about. Some of you attended the Tuesday workshop where I talked about universities as political institutions in society. I'm not going to go very far into that, but basically the argument is that there is enough historical evidence to show that from the very inception of universities in the 11th century, these institutions have been plagued with internal conflicts and confrontations over the role of institutions, the alignment of institutions with other institutions of society, and we will see some of these in the next few slides and the latter part of the presentations. Then I try to hook up with the topic of this conference. Are universities really dynamic or not? And what does that mean? I'm going to go very fast through several paradigms of ways in which the university has been portrayed historically, and then focus a little bit more on the 1960s and a period of intense politicization at universities, because I think it's relevant for our understanding of universities today. Then I'm going to look at the prevailing mainstream portrait of universities as some of the motors of the knowledge economy and so heavily connected to that. And finally, I'm going to close with my arguments about the repoliticization of the university in current times. So, are universities really dynamic? This has been a matter of huge debate. And it's absolutely contradictory. When we look at our university celebrations and we see people wearing long togas and strange hats and these very fancy collars and stuff like that, and things being said in Latin, and universities stay using their coat of arms with Latin logos and things like that, you say, wow, are we so proud of our historical pedigree? This is the way I think of it. We like to celebrate our PhDs by dressing up very clownish style, and we all do it, by the way, even if we criticize it. In the end, we're so proud of our degrees that we just fill into the way in which university people have to perform. So that would say we haven't changed much in 10 centuries. And that makes us proud too. And we are very fast to say that universities are amongst one of the most stable institutions in society. 10 centuries of universities. That is amazing. Yeah, there's more than 10 centuries of bakeries, but you never hear a baker saying, oh, I'm so proud of my heritage as a baker or something like that. Still, universities, we have managed to portray ourselves in such a way that we can talk about our ancient history as something that makes us strong, that makes us important to society, that makes us very, very central to what is going on in the world at every moment. There has been a lot of discussion about university and change. Philip Albach, for example, made this oversweeping statement around in the 1970s, saying that universities were amongst the most conservative institutions in society. And he said, universities are always talking about change, but they seldom change. Now, if we see universities historically, it is very difficult to say that they have not changed over these 10 centuries of existence. And I try to look at continuity and disruption. You see my lack of ability with the PowerPoint, something missing there, continuity and, by just trying to revise a few paradigms that have historically branded universities and describe their roles and the way they perform. So we had the university originally, after the students built the first university in Bologna, basically to get a degree in order to perform professionally, and they organized themselves and they paid for faculty. That didn't last for long. Somebody came out and took the university out of the students' hands, which is usually what they want to do everywhere, all the time, in the 11th century and today when it happens. So the religion, the Catholic Church mainly, and the established monarchies in Europe fought over universities. This happened in Spain, it happened in France. It created so much conflict that there were constant migrations from the University of Paris to England. Cambridge and Oxford were founded. Two universities because they fought in one of them and then they went to the other one. So conflict was all over the place, and the basic tension was around if the university was going to align itself with the Catholic Church or with the monarchy. In Henry VIII era, the big intellectual debates happened outside of universities, and basically universities had to align themselves with the monarch and be participants in the creation of the Church of England. So they were against the Pope. So you could see instances of this conflict going on and on through centuries. The legacy of that type of confrontation for many years, for even centuries, was this constant tension within institutions between scholastic performance, that is, thinking and rethinking about classical and religious texts, versus the emerging scientific thought. You know, people were burned for saying that the Earth moved around the sun and not the other way around. And these debates took place inside and outside of universities. So this tension, which lasted for much longer in universities, for example, in colonial countries, in Africa and Latin America, were constantly a contrast between the development of institutions in different places. Then, if we move further down to the 18th century, we have one of the first very clear projects, national projects for a university. While the German nation was being built, bringing together different small realms and small, they were not even republics, but being brought together to build the Weimar Republic, Humboldt thought about the university in two distinct directions. One was the role in a national identity formation as a key issue in developing a university. That was the main purpose of the university, according to Humboldt. And the second one was to be able to establish connections between scientific thought in the university and emerging industrialization. And so this gave birth to one of the most referential models of higher education institutions, a different paradigms. We're already in the third, at least, and we could maybe, if we go dig deeper, we could make sub-paradigms of each of these ones. When the German model moves to the United States after the independence of the United States from Britain, there's another new model developing in that part of the world. It is also bearing attention within it. On one hand, it brings in the idea of liberal education from British higher education. But on the other hand, there is this agricultural orientation that is expressed in the land grant policies by the states or the state. It's very difficult to deal with this in the United States, such a federated country with so much independence by each of the states. But basically, universities were entrusted with public funds and public lands in order not only to deal with general and liberal education, but to be able to connect with agricultural production. And in some ways, part of the Humboldtian model was brought into the American university to establish the first connections with growing enterprises and industrialization. Then comes, of course, in the middle of the 20th century, the golden era of the university. After the Second World War, the big expansion in the U.S. through the GI Bill, which allowed the soldiers that were coming back from the war to enroll in colleges and universities, the building of new constructions on campuses, new universities all over the place, and it's the big expansion of higher education all over the world. Enrollments go up, and public funding for institutions goes up very strongly, and it seems to be a very stable moment where universities are at the epitome of this mythology of academic freedom, autonomy, self-governance, etc. Now, all of that has to be qualified in some ways, because it's also the time, one of the peak times of the Cold War. So academic freedom and autonomy coexist, for example, with the loyalty oath in the United States, where faculty, in order to be able to be appointed as such in public institutions, had to sign this loyalty oath and declare that they were not members of the Communist Party, they would never be members of the Communist Party, they would never follow any communist directive, and they would be loyal to the American presidency and the values of the forefathers, and all these things that the Americans say all over the place. So, just to show you, in a very brief amount of time, I have covered a very long set of historical periods where universities have changed and the paradigms about universities changed. So I want to focus on the 1960s because nobody planned for this change. There was no Humboldt drawing down what the role of institutions would be. Probably the 1960s have been totally underrated. We haven't done the necessary work to understand how much the world changed in the 1960s and how much universities and university faculty and university students were involved in changing contemporary society. There was this big cultural change. Talk about family, talk about sex, talk about a lot of relationships in society, music, cultural expressions, painting, everything changed in the 1960s. And a lot of that had to do with very strong student movements, with the rejection by American faculty of the loyalty oath. This happened, first of all, in Berkeley, where the faculty said, no more, we're not going to sign that loyalty oath, no more. And this is about the same time as the free speech movement comes about, 1962 in Berkeley. But basically, just not to go in detail over each of these processes happening at the time, but we had in almost all of the world anti-authoritarian and pro-democracy movements, for example, in Mexico, with a huge student movement that ended up with 400 students killed in the Tlatelolco Plaza in 1968, or the student movement in Czechoslovakia with Jan Benes turning fire on himself as a protest over the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and university students striking in their struggle for a democratic socialism. Then we had, also in the 60s, the struggles for civil rights in the United States, committed students that were doing all these freedom walks and these freedom tours to the southern states of the United States in order to promote voting enrollment and voting rights, for racial equality and anti-apartheid, not only in the US but in South Africa. This is a moment where black consciousness comes as a concept within higher education and feeds into the ANC and other anti-apartheid groups in South Africa in these big struggles that started a major shift that ended up maybe 30 years later with the surrender or the falling apart of the apartheid regime. There were a lot of national liberation struggles, starting with Cuba in 1959. The Cuban leadership of the revolution had all been student leaders in the University of Havana in the 1950s. But then came the struggles against the war in Vietnam and Algeria, mainly in France and the United States, but almost all over the world. Demonstrations against these colonial wars and anti-colonial uprisings were happening in all of Latin America, Africa, and a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, not to mention the United States, that had a major involvement in the Vietnam War. Stemming from these student movements, a lot of topics that are today on the table that have been discussed for decades now really gained a lot of thrust in like a second wave of feminism after the right to vote for women had organized a lot of women's struggles. From the universities came feminism and gender equality struggles that have made a lot of advances, especially at university levels, but has projected towards society in general. Environmentalism, the first issues of sustainability and the environment started to come up from the 1960s movements in universities in Europe and the United States mainly. A lot of struggles in African and Latin American universities about social justice and revolution. Governments were put in place. In many cases, faculty and students, the universities themselves, were involved in this process. And, of course, this huge cultural change that generated a lot of values that were later, many of them coalesced and called political correctness, the way to behave regarding others, regarding difference, regarding otherness, and which are very relevant to note because of the times we are living in right now. So after this politicization process in the 1960s, when the student movements start to go down, the critical role of universities This didn't happen, of course, in one moment and exactly at the same time everywhere. But it started to erode, to come down, to diminish. And there was like a period of neutrality where usually in many countries, governments bought social peace with universities, with the urban middle classes, through increased budgets and financial allocations for public institutions, the expansion of enrollments, and the creation of new universities. They were trying to bring this critical mass of university people into the political systems. And they did it pretty successfully. Then, by the end of the 1970s, we have the Thatcher and Reagan revolution, and everything, in my view, started going downhill from there. Other people, like Burton Clark, think that it's when things started going upwards and the universities started to get better and become entrepreneurial. I think that even though the entrepreneurial university is not written until later, by the 1990s, this idea that the universities have to be these centers of knowledge development that are heavily, very strongly connected to industrial expansion, to the new digital era, to the technology transfers, to focus universities on graduate studies and science production, but not only publications, but innovation and technology. Technology is the big word, and universities were very, very much geared into that idea. Technology transfers office in every university where there are no technology transfers possible or necessary. No. Or even thinkable, because there's no technology development in most of the institutions in the world, and because there is no market for knowledge developed in universities almost anywhere outside from the United States. Maybe a few countries, maybe Germany a little bit, or the UK. But basically, this is a US model that has been portrayed as the successful model everywhere else. So we are set up in an international competition, which later in the early 2000s, in 2003 with the Shanghai ranking, is this competition is measured by this apparently very objective type of classification of institutions, very hierarchical, very much focused essentially on the international circulation of knowledge through publications in index journals. And based on that general idea that they could establish some qualification of the quality of institutions all over the world and their ability to compete with each other for the best students, for resources at the international level, and for the best faculty too. But this paradigm, as many of the other paradigms, are based in a lot of mythical ideas. And of course, there's part of reality. There's been the reality of this entrepreneurial university is the amazing growth of, let me use this very bad word, shitty publications in scientific journals. No? Because nobody says that we have much better publications. We have many more publications, but it's almost impossible to say that knowledge that has been produced in these last 20 to 25 years is really a quantum leap in our ability to understand nature, to understand society, to understand about anything. No? So let us look a little bit at one of the ways in which we can measure the mythical part of the university in the knowledge economy. This is about university patents. And university patents is, as I was telling you, basically a US endeavor. It doesn't happen much anywhere else, maybe some Asian universities. Just look at this data. No? Look at the growth of university patents versus the growth of patents overall, granted in the United States from in these 20 years. This is, if you look at the growth of university patents from 1969 to 2012, it's about the same. So there is no quantum leap in this transfer of knowledge. These are only granted patents. there is not enough information to look at licensed patents. Licensed patents are the ones that produce money. The other one you can store, or you can get a diploma in your faculty office saying, René has got a patent, and he's very important. I'm sure in some areas it's really important. If I were to get a patent, I don't know of what, but probably my CV would be enriched and I would be more favorably assessed or evaluated as a faculty member. But who knows if my institution didn't lose money, because most institutions lose money when they go through the patenting process. Now look at the second part of the data. The participation in the whole amount of patents, in the total amount of granted patents, didn't grow. It's almost negligible, no? So are universities the driving force of the information economy and the knowledge economy? This data doesn't seem to support that myth. Then look at this other one. At least 620 US research universities received federal funding for research. This is in 2014. I'm sorry that I didn't put the number there. Only 100 of these 620 have 5 patents or more per year. So you move from the University of California that has like 400 patents a year, and the next one is 200, and then it goes to 100. It moves downwards very rapidly. So 25 US universities concentrate 50% of university granted patents since 1969. So does that account for a solid view of the entrepreneurial institution that is transferring knowledge at a fast pace and having a very strong impact upon the knowledge economy and the information age? I don't think so. But university presidents and university boards and even us faculty and students, we have bought into the project. And we think that we are extremely relevant to the knowledge society. And of course, there has historically been professional formation. That has, probably our graduates are much better than they were before. I don't put that in doubt. But is that necessarily an outcome of the university being geared towards the knowledge society? Is the increase in master's and doctoral degrees driven by the knowledge economy or by the fact that undergraduate enrollments are becoming almost universal in some countries? Is it only demographics? Nobody's done a lot of studies about this, because challenging the myth that we are very important because we are part of the international competition that is driving the world ahead in this intense knowledge economy struggle and path towards the future. It's an interesting myth, and universities are really good with myths, and we can embody them in very nice ways. Now let's see what is happening to us now. While we were thinking about knowledge transfers and competition and our important role in society, a lot of things starting to happen in the world. I'm going to go to the second slide and come back to this one. We never thought this could happen. We got together with our colleagues from the US universities, and everybody told you, oh, there's no way that Trump is going to be the Republican candidate. That is never going to happen. Once that happened, then they told you, no. And we believed it because we thought it the same way. There's no way he's going to be the president. Nobody would vote, in their sound judgment, would vote for him. Because, he's racist. He has done sexual harassment. Everybody knows that. He's proud of it. How women are not going to vote for him? Poor people can't vote for somebody that is going to strip them away from health care. That's not going to happen. And it happened. And one of the things that it showed is that as universities all over the world, we are so strongly disconnected with what is going on around us. We don't even understand our own environment. The same thing happened in the UK. So I'll get back to the Trump thing, the Trump phenomenon. But I want to just show you things that are happening in the world, have been happening for the last 5 years, and maybe we haven't taken notice about it. Lots of struggles for access, free higher education, and against for-profit higher education. In the UK, they even burnt the Conservative Party's building in London. No, Germany obtained in 2015 the tuition-free higher education. Occupy Wall Street students were complaining about the costs of student debts. Chile student movements put 100,000 people on the streets, and they gained tuition-free higher education. It's being debated in Congress. Colombia, exactly the same, and Puerto Rico. So we have very, very big student movements all over the world about access to higher education institutions. No wonder. If we're telling everybody that universities are the driving force, everybody wants to be part of that. Now, there are not enough public universities, and demand is much larger than the possibilities for access. Then we have very political processes. Brazilian federal universities were banned by the government to discuss the congressional coup d'etat against the legal president, Dilma Rousseff. And the rectors had to go to the Supreme Court in Brazil to guarantee the right for university members, faculty and students, to debate the political situation in Brazil at the time. And they won. Of course, the process was lost because Congress got rid of Dilma Rousseff, and all these corrupt Brazilian politicians are in power right now. But the universities played a major role. The students mobilized, and the rectors did a joint action towards the Supreme Court. Colombian universities, when the vote for peace happened in the referendum, it was called Universities for Peace. All of the universities in the country coalesced, calling the population to vote in favor of peace in the referendum, and the referendum was lost. Later, it was in some ways reversed. Faculty and students on universities called against the vote for Brexit in the UK, not very successful either, but it's very clear that educated people voted against Brexit. The indignado students in Spain have developed two political parties that have totally changed the political scenario in Spain. One a right-wing party, and another a left-wing, Podemos, and the right-wing Ciudadanos. Now, rectors in Venezuela reject both the government and the opposition in their confrontation in the last 6 or 7 months. And students struggle in South Africa. They are bringing down the statues of Rhodes, this very racist, apparently very gracious philanthropist of higher education in South Africa. So let's get back to the US. I'm almost going to be over. Trump symbolizes everything that challenges higher education. We are, in front of that, we are isolated. Our political and academic values have been challenged. Not only all this political correctness stemming from universities as a way to interact with each other have been put into question by the ways in which the president behaved even before he was voted. So this gender neutral or race inclusive discourse and performance has been thrown out, and people voted for that, and that's a vote against universities. But even more so, Trump is a champion of alternative facts. So alternative facts is whatever he wants to make at every moment, starting with the environment. Oh, there's no global warming. It's these university wackos that are deciding that the Earth is warming up. There's no evidence about that. I have alternative facts. So we can drill in Alaska, we can bring down trees, we can do everything. Nothing is happening to the environment. Now the universities have started to react after decades of passivity by university administrations and faculty, universities are starting to criticize. There's a very nice written piece by the president of Bard College, Leonard Botstein, saying American universities must take a stand. And this hasn't happened for a long time in the US and in many other countries either. So the nature of universities themselves and the idea of pursuit of knowledge is put into question by the very existence of a discourse of alternative facts. And the colleges and universities, a lot of them very prestigious, have criticized immigration bans and the bringing down of the Dreamers Act that is throwing a lot of Mexican young people away from the US and who were enrolled in higher education or educational projects. So I just want to finish by saying we are living in a changing moment. The discourse is starting to focus more on the increasing crisis of political systems, political parties, representations, people representation, and political discourse all over the world. And universities are starting to play a major role on those topics again. I'm not saying that a shift of paradigm implies that suddenly universities are going to stop publishing, they're going to close their technology transfer office and abandon the idea that we are the drivers of the knowledge economy. But at least we have to bring into the forefront the notion that political institutions in society are in crisis and that universities, as another political institution in society in which critical thinking and moral authority is based on knowledge, are called to play a major role in the political construction of our contemporary world. So I think that, yes, there's a need to be dynamic, but the dynamics are not necessarily the dynamics of the economic world, which has driven us for 3 decades now. And probably it's very useful, at least, not to replace the economic cost-benefit analysis that has been the mainstream driving force for university policy in the last decades, but incorporate a political understanding of where is it that our universities are being located and what are the political and societal challenges that are being brought upon our institutions, not only in order to survive, to be able to adapt and to continue existing for another centuries with our caps and gowns, but in order to be able to have an impact in political change and societal change in the near future. Thank you very much.
Perfectly quite in time, just less than 45 minutes, so we have plenty of time for questions and comments. You're welcome to ask in Russian or in English. We have simultaneous translation, so please, someone. Now I can see. Everything is so clear or so provoking. You have a question. Oh, okay.
Спасибо. Thank you for an interesting presentation, perhaps the best presentation at this conference, in my view, because research projects about the past and the present, you went over to discussing the future of universities. In your presentation, why can identify several generations of universities? It's a fashion to use these phrases: university 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 1.0 was a scholastic university, and that's the era of the birth of universities. 2.0 is a research university, Humboldtian model 3.0, and thank you for distinction and debunking this myth of entrepreneurial university, which is being implemented very narrowly locally. What would be a 4.0 university? A political university or some other university? and what would be the major set of problems that they will be dealing with as a driver of development processes, not just reproducing old knowledge, old thinking formats, but as a driver of social development. So what will be a 4.0 university be about? Thank you.
I was always very bad at keeping track with software based on the 1.0 and 1.1 and all this stuff. But I agree with you that we have had these overlapping paradigmatic changes. And it's very difficult to have a crystal ball to show what universities are going to look like in the future. But I do think that the pendulum that moved towards basic sciences and engineering and technology, high technology content, research and teaching is probably going to move slightly back to the humanities and the social sciences. There's going to be a need for a wider type of economic thought, not only modeling economics and econometrics and stuff like that, but more history of economics. It's my view. There's going to be a need. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm trying to focus on what's going to be needed, what is already needed, more historical perspectives about society and education in general, and much more sociology or sociological, not to narrow it to a discipline, but more to a field of studies, sociological understandings of society. Basically, I think that we have to be able to reverse one of the major shifts that happened in the late 1970s, which was called by Sheldon Walling the economization of public philosophy, when everything that we thought was public interaction in the social, cultural, and political realm suddenly was narrowed down into cost-benefit and economic analysis. We have to be able to enrich our own lives through knowledge in terms of being able to think about what really goes on in our everyday life, and it's not necessarily a rational economic set of decisions that are being made by individuals or institutions. And if you look at the last Nobel Prize in economics, some of that work is making headway. When you bring social behavioral theories into what used to be considered one of the basic foundations of new economics, the rationality of economic decision-making has been put into question very strongly. I think we're moving in the direction of a broadening the scope of knowledge and understanding that goes way beyond economics and technology and innovation in the economic spheres and industrial spheres. So I think that we have to recover the universal nature of universities in terms of being able to address different types of knowledge and human activities. Please.
The history. I want to go back to the 1960s and the politicization that happened in universities at that point. One of the effects of the revolts of the 1960s was also changes in the internal governance and organization of universities. And one of the dramatic changes that took place in the aftermath of the 1960s was that in many countries students were allowed into governing bodies. They were suddenly part of decision making. You saw junior faculty also being allowed into the decision making bodies, even administrators. And you also saw in many countries a lot of people from outside the university coming into the university. And I'm curious how you interpret that kind of change in the governance of university, especially when you compare it to what you call the second, maybe the emergence of the second politicization phase of the university now. Do we see that because these governance structures that that developed in the aftermath of the 1960s, that they didn't really bring they didn't deliver on the promise? Or how do you assess these structures that popped up after the 1960s?
I would say that in thanks. In many countries, shared governance existed way before the 1960s. In the US, for example, there was student participation. It was small, but it existed. In Latin America, it was co-governance since 1918 in Argentina, and it spread all over the continent. And I think it brought many problems to the floor of university governments, but it also brought the possibility of building legitimate consensual decision into the running of everyday life in institutions. I'm not sure, I haven't done enough studies to argue that shared governance didn't deliver on the promise. What I think is that we suddenly were challenged with the efficiency discourse. And shared governance is less efficient than having managerial governance of institutions. But I have an argument that is very important. I think we all share some ideas of what universities should look like, and autonomy is a highly valued notion about higher education in universities and colleges. In my view, the possibilities of exercising real autonomy depend on two basic issues. One is the ability to build internal coalitions within universities vis-à-vis external bodies in the government or the broader state. The second one is the ability to connect with social constituencies in the universities. We are doing badly in both directions. Sheila Slaughter argued in 1983, if I'm not mistaken, that universities were in danger because they were very expensive and the people didn't feel that universities were looking at them and thinking about their problems. And I think that the vote in the United States, in some ways, the voters for Trump place universities as part of the status quo and the government, the big government, what they call big government. But on the internal side, I think that collegial running of universities has been substituted for managerial expertise. And that certainly hasn't delivered in order to allow universities to remain as collegial institutions in which their life is being driven by knowledge exchange and knowledge creation. So probably what we need to think about is a good middle point between the use of expertise in the management, administrative part of the university, but rebuilding the collegial and politicized expressions of co-governance in order to maintain adequate equilibrium within our institutions.
Yes, hi. Mark Johnson, UW-Madison. I have two things. Yes, thank you for a really extraordinary presentation. And I agree with you about the global transformations of the late 1960s, especially 1968, quite literally in Mexico City, Indonesia, China, and Prague. And there's two parts of that are really compelling, and I'd like to end with a question to the group. There's a very powerful historical account by Jeremy Surrey. I believe it's Power and Dissent, and he makes the kind of larger argument that the superpowers recognized in the face of this radical mobilization that they had to wind down the Cold War and begin the process of demilitarization at the level of geopolitics. So détente began, the U.S. reached out to communist China, the Vietnam War began winding down, and then in exchange for that, domestically, In the United States, certainly there were concessions made around student role in governance and the quality of student services and dormitories, but there was also very selective repression against the most radical students. So the most radical elements in the anti-war movement and the racial justice movements were often expelled from the universities. We saw brutal repression in Mexico and Indonesia and elsewhere. And ultimately, of course, in China as well, when the students involved in the Cultural Revolution were put down by the Chinese army in the end of the 1960s. So the geopolitics of that moment, and Suri's book is complicated because it's a very positive story that we stepped back from the brink of nuclear confrontation, but in exchange for this very complicated kind of rebalancing of the domestic political equilibrium. And of course, in Latin America, there was a whole series of military coups in the years that followed in reaction to that as well. And then I'm intrigued, very intrigued, and I'd like to open this question up to the audience as a whole, because one of the anomalies in the late 1960s was the relative quiescence of Soviet students in the Soviet Union. And now there were exceptions to that. There were incidents at Saratov State that were hushed up and there were elements of Soviet movements. They were certainly very active in the Prague Spring. But I'm kind of curious about the history of the Studienčestvo and the politics of that in the 1960s and 1970s. And in a sense, perhaps it was simply a delayed reaction where we saw a very prominent role for young people and students and university leaders in the independence movements of the late 1980s. And you saw that in Georgia, and you saw that in Kyrgyzstan, where sort of academics emerged as the leaders of the independent republics after the end of the Soviet Union with Oskar Akayev and others. But I'm kind of curious about that, the analogs to this global phenomena in the Soviet system.
I have no clue. I think it's a fascinating topic, and probably you could have much more information, or our colleagues here who understand the Soviet transition and the pre-transition period better.
You have comment to this question, or you have another question? Okay, let's move to another question.
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Vasily from Omsk. Thank you for your presentation. Because you appeal the universities to be within the political and social life. But please tell us, what mechanisms do you see available for universities for this kind of this disruption? These are new mechanisms, or this mechanism already existing? The universities can be also prepare the elites, the revolutionary movements, or any expert councils. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasily, for your question. I think that there's not a unique recipe for this. It depends a lot on the political context in each of our countries. But I think that first we need to recover the notion of faculty as public intellectuals, especially faculty in the social sciences. Not in many countries, faculty write in newspapers and have editorial pieces or op-ed pieces commenting on political or other type or social events that are happening. But also seeing what is happening in the US, you see another level of university involvement, which is when rectors coalesce and sign up declarations like this very long list of U.S. universities signing against the immigration bans, or when you have the Chilean rectors, the Council of Chilean University Rectors, all of the universities in Chile supporting the students in their struggle against tuition. So then you have the administrative level of the university committed with some political processes. Then you have the students are the most dynamic force in the institutions all the time. So a repoliticization of university life would necessarily pass for reopening the spaces for student organization and student debates and student commitment to what is happening outside. We have been driving our students away from society and telling them that they have to look at very narrow topics in order to finish their dissertation, not to be excessively ambitious, not to be creative enough. You have to be able to compete for a position out there. So we as faculty have to be a driving force in helping students to grasp their role as one of the most significant transformers of contemporary societies. And these are only some of the ways, but also the research projects that we tackle, that we incorporate into our programs in our institutions. We have done away with a lot of stuff, but we have also made headway. There are gender studies programs in many universities. Should we adopt new ones? Should we make them broader? Should we be more political in these projects in rejecting the, let's say, like the male domination backlash that is happening in many countries in the world? So I think that there's a wide variety of actions that can be taken in different levels of commitment, even individual commitment. It can happen from the classroom upwards. Thank you.
Okay, we are near to finish our session. Very thank you for your presentation and for your question and discussion. But we need to go forward to Chris Murphy report, and just to keep on our good pace, thank you so much, and let's finish this part of session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you very much.